When my phone buzzed that morning, I thought it was another Christmas photo from my son's family. Instead, it was a text from my daughter-in-law, Lena. "You're not expected this Christmas." I read it twice, waiting for the sting to fade. It didn't. After 5 years of paying their mortgage, covering their bills, and buying gifts for their little boy, I had just been uninvited, erased from my own family's holiday. I didn't argue, I didn't beg. I just smiled, set the phone down, and poured myself another cup of tea. My husband used to say, "The quiet ones always strike last." 2 days later, I woke to 22 missed calls. The same woman who told me I wasn't welcome was now sobbing on my voicemail. Something about the bank, a frozen account, and a terrible mistake. This isn't a story about tears or pity. It's a story about dignity and what happens when you push a good woman too far. Because that Christmas I gave them a gift they'd never forget. The kind that doesn't come wrapped in ribbons, but in consequences. Keep listening. You'll want to hear how silence became my sweetest revenge. My name is Mary Delgado Collins. I'm 68 years old, a retired gardener, and a widow for nearly a decade now. I live in a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of Dayton, Ohio, where the winters are long and the silence tends to linger. My hands are rough from years of pruning roses and planting spring bulbs, but I've always believed that hard work keeps a person honest. I never had much, but I had my family, and for me, that was enough. Or at least I thought it was. The text came early that morning just as the kettle started to hum. My phone buzzed against the counter, lighting up with a name that always gave me a tiny jolt of hope: Lena, my daughter-in-law. For a moment, I imagined it might be a photo of my grandson helping decorate their tree, or maybe a message asking about my old recipe for Christmas tamales. But when I read the words, the steam seemed to leave both the kettle and my heart. "You're not expected this Christmas. We'll be with real family." I stared at it, not quite believing. The letters sat there cold and sharp, like frost on glass. Real family. I whispered the words out loud, as if saying them might make them less cruel. But they only echoed through the empty kitchen landing, heavy on the oak table, where I used to roll out pie dough with my late husband, Carlos. We always said Christmas was about opening your home, not closing your heart. I set the phone down and turned off the kettle before it could whistle. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. Instead, I stood there for a while staring out the window at the snow-covered garden. The rose bushes I'd trimmed last fall were just thin, black silhouettes now, but I knew they'd bloom again come spring. Life had a way of returning even after the coldest seasons. I poured myself a cup of tea and let the heat seep through the mug into my palms. The house smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon leftovers from the few decorations I'd hung more out of habit than expectation. I had no plans for Christmas now. No dinner to cook, no gifts to wrap. Just silence. And maybe that was all right. "Would you like to play Christmas music?" Alexa's voice startled me from the counter. I looked over at the small, blinking light on the speaker and let out a quiet laugh. "No, Alexa. Call Karma." There was a pause, a faint whir, and then the polite, almost cheerful voice replied, "I'm sorry. I don't see a contact named Karma." That made me laugh again. Really laugh this time. It felt strange, the sound of it in an empty room. "Oh, don't worry, sweetheart," I said, still smiling. "She'll call them soon enough." I took my tea to the table and sat down looking at the phone once more. I could have replied. I could have asked what I'd done wrong, or reminded Lena of the 5 years I'd been quietly sending $2,800 each month to cover their mortgage. I could have mentioned the furniture I'd helped buy, the repairs I'd paid for the nights I'd watched my grandson so they could go to fancy dinners. But what good would it do? I'd learned a long time ago that some people hear only what flatters them. Instead, I opened the old photo album that still sat on the end of the table. There was a picture of last Christmas, David carving the turkey, Lena arranging the napkins, my grandson holding up a gingerbread man, almost too big for his hand. My hair was pinned back, apron dusted with flour, and I remember thinking, this is what happiness looks like. Funny how you never realize when a moment is about to become a memory. I touched Carlos's face in one of the older photos. He was grinning, wearing that silly Santa hat I could never get him to take off during dinner. He'd always said, "Mary, don't worry about what people give you. Watch what they take for granted." And I think at that moment, I finally understood what he meant. The clock ticked. The snow outside had thickened soft flakes swirling under the yellow porch light. I rose slowly, setting my cup in the sink, and walked down the narrow hallway toward my office, a little room that smelled of paper and old wood. The filing cabinet stood against the far wall, its metal drawer cool to the touch. I hesitated for just a second before pulling it open. Inside were neatly labeled folders: utilities, insurance, medical, mortgage payments, David and Lena. I slid the last folder out and placed it on the desk. There they were, 5 years of canceled checks, bank receipts, and wire transfers. Every month, every sacrifice recorded in tidy rows. Proof that love in this house had always come with a receipt. For a moment, I traced my name on the top of the first statement. Mary Delgado Collins, co-signer. It had felt like such a good idea at the time. Help them get started, I'd told myself. Families help each other. That's what Carlos would have wanted. Now the papers looked different, less like generosity, and more like leverage. I closed the folder carefully, the corners perfectly aligned, and placed it back in the drawer. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, but there was something steadier in her eyes. A calmness, a decision forming in the quiet. I turned off the lamp, the room falling into a soft, amber glow from the hallway. As I reached for the door, I paused and whispered almost to myself, maybe this year, silence will speak louder than love. Those were the last words I whispered to myself before turning out the lights that night. In the morning, the house was quiet, the air cold enough that my breath lingered in front of me as I waited for the coffee to brew. I had slept surprisingly well, though something inside me had shifted. I wasn't angry. Anger was noisy, and I'd already given enough of my life to noise. What I felt now was something different. Still, measured. Like the calm that comes before you decide to prune a branch that's grown too wild. I opened my phone, and before I could even check my messages, a notification appeared from social media. I hadn't used it much, mostly to see photos of my grandson, but curiosity made me tap. There she was, Lena. Perfect Lena with her honey-colored hair and that practiced smile that never reached her eyes. The caption read, "Grateful for another beautiful year in our dream home. Hard work pays off." The photo showed her and David in front of the house I'd helped them buy, a Christmas wreath on the door matching designer sweaters. My stomach tightened. I could almost hear Carlos's voice in my head. People who brag about blessings they didn't earn always forget who paid the bill. I scrolled further. Picture after picture, a new living room set, gold-edged dinner plates, a car wrapped in a red bow. All the things my $2,800 a month had made possible. And under each post, her followers commented, #goals. What a power couple. You're living the dream, I laughed, though it came out bitter. I'd seen that dream up close, and I knew exactly who was paying for it. Later that week, David called. He always sounded busy now, as if talking to me were something squeezed between meetings. "Hey, Mom," he said, "Lena's planning a dinner with her parents next weekend. They're coming in from Chicago. You know how she wants everything just right." I smiled into the phone. I'm sure she does. She feels like sometimes you don't quite fit in with them. Different backgrounds, you know? She said maybe you could come by another time after the holidays. Different backgrounds. I repeated the words slow, almost tasting them. You mean because I used to work in people's gardens and not behind an office desk? No, that's not what she meant, David rushed. She just worries you might feel uncomfortable. Uncomfortable, I said softly, watching the snow gather outside my window. I see. He hesitated, then added quietly, Mom, you know Lena. She just wants things to look polished. I didn't answer right away. My son's voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but what I heard underneath was fear. Fear of his own wife, fear of confrontation, fear of rocking the glossy little boat they'd built on my steady current of monthly deposits. When I finally spoke, I said, David, don't worry about me. I'll be just fine. And I meant it. A few days later, Helen stopped by with a tin of cookies. She was my neighbor, my oldest friend, and she'd seen enough of life to know when something was off. You look too calm, Mary, she said, setting the cookies on the table. That's when people should worry about you, I laughed. Calm is underrated. She poured herself some coffee and asked, You seen what that girl's been posting? My niece showed me. Lord, if pride were a paycheck, she'd be rich. She's proud of the show, I said simply. But I've decided I don't need a front row seat anymore. That evening, I got another glimpse of her show. Lena had gone live online streaming her dinner party preparations. Her voice carried through my phone like a knife wrapped in silk. Oh, David's mom. She's sweet, but simple. You know, she still sends handwritten cards for birthdays. Adorable. She laughed, and one of her friends off camera said something I couldn't hear. Then Lena added, She means well, but she doesn't really belong when my parents visit. It's just a different world. A different world. That was the phrase that landed hardest. As if kindness and humility were foreign languages to her, and the only currency she valued came with interest rates. I closed the app, laid the phone on the table, and stared at the clock. 10 minutes until my scheduled bank transfer, the same one I'd been making automatically for 5 years. For a moment, I thought about the first time I'd set it up. David had just been promoted, they'd been expecting their first child, and the bank had required a cosigner. Just until we're stable, he'd promised. I hadn't even hesitated. That's what mothers do. We build bridges out of our savings and call them love. But somewhere along the line, love had turned into obligation, and obligation into expectation. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed softly against the dim light of the kitchen. I navigated to my online banking page, the familiar numbers staring back at me. Automatic transfer, $2,800, mortgage payment, David and Lena, Taste. I hovered over the cancel button, listening to the old house settle around me. The heater clicked on a low hum, filling the quiet. Then with one small, deliberate motion, I pressed stop. A confirmation window popped up. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring payment? Yes, I said aloud, my voice steady. I'm sure. The screen blinked, the line disappeared. And just like that, so did my part in their perfect picture. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty white space where the payment confirmation used to be. It felt strangely quiet, almost holy. I expected guilt to creep in, maybe fear or second thoughts. But what I felt instead was a deep, steady calm. Like I'd finally set down a heavy box I'd been carrying for years without realizing how much it weighed. I leaned back in my chair, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. My hands, rough from years of gardening, rested in my lap. I looked at them, the same hands that had held David's when he took his first steps. The same hands that packed his lunch for school, that signed loan documents, that mailed checks month after month, so he and his wife could live a life they didn't have to earn. 5 years of steady giving, and in return, one text message to erase me from their table. It's funny how money becomes invisible when it's given out of love. I never thought of those transfers as charity or sacrifice. I thought of them as roots, something solid that helped my son's life grow. When David first came to me about the mortgage, he was nervous, shoulders tense, like a boy asking for permission. Mom, he'd said, "We've found this house. It's everything we dreamed of. But the bank says we need a cosigner, just until we get established." He looked so hopeful then. I remember the day vividly. We sat at my old kitchen table, with the sunlight cutting across the wood, the smell of fresh soil still on my hands from the morning's work. He promised it would only be temporary, that once Lena's business took off, they'd take me off the loan. "You'll never even have to worry about it, Mom," he'd said. But promises are lighter than paper when money is involved. The bank didn't care about promises, it cared about income. My name carried enough stability to get them approved. I didn't think twice. What mother would I wanted him to have the life Carlos and I had worked so hard to give him the stability, the home, the laughter that filled the walls? I didn't realize then that sometimes giving too much makes people forget the value of what they've been given. When the down payment came due, I didn't have enough in savings. So I went to my bedroom, opened the little jewelry box on the dresser, and took out my wedding ring. The gold was worn thin, the diamonds small, but it had been mine for 40 years. I can still remember the sound it made when I placed it on the pawn shop counter, a soft metallic click that sounded like a goodbye. I told myself it was for the future, for family. Carlos would have understood. He always said rings can be replaced. Family can't. But I don't think even he could have imagined how wrong that would turn out to be. The payments began soon after. $2,800 every month automatically drawn from my account. I covered repairs when the roof leaked, paid for the nursery furniture, even chipped in for a new washing machine when theirs broke. I remember once during a visit, Lena had admired the kitchen island and said, "We really went all out, didn't we?" I smiled then, not saying that my check had gone out with it. Year after year, I watched them build their image, their so-called perfect life, while I quietly made it possible. I didn't expect gratitude, but I did expect decency. When Lena started treating me like the help instead of family, I thought maybe it was stress. Maybe she was tired. But no, it wasn't exhaustion, it was entitlement. And entitlement, I've learned, doesn't recognize kindness. It mistakes it for weakness. I thought about the time she told a friend right in front of me, "Mary's sweet, but she doesn't really understand our lifestyle." I'd laughed politely, pretending not to care. But that night I'd gone home and looked around my little house, the cracked linoleum floor, the second-hand couch, the fading photos on the wall, and realized something. I'd been giving her everything I had, while she gave me the smallest sliver of respect she could manage. Now, sitting there in the glow of my computer screen, I let that truth settle. 5 years, 60 months. $140,000 of my retirement gone to keep their illusion alive. And for what? So that Lena could host dinner parties with people who thought Gardner was a punchline. So that my son could avoid one uncomfortable conversation at the expense of his mother's dignity. I closed the laptop and pushed my chair back, the legs scraping softly against the floor. The house felt warm, almost protective, like it was holding its breath with me. Outside, the snow had started falling again, thick, steady flakes that covered everything, no matter how dirty or cracked. I thought of Carlos then, of what he would have said if he'd seen me selling his ring, or writing those checks, or reading that text. I think he would have looked at me the way he always did, with that half smile, that meant he understood even before I spoke. And I think he would have said, "Enough, Mary, enough." I stood up, turned off the light, and whispered into the quiet kitchen. If they want independence, they'll have it completely. That was the promise I made to myself, and I meant it. The next morning, I woke to a house that felt different. Not lighter, but more purposeful. The weight that had sat on my chest for months had shifted into something sharper, steadier. I wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. I was a woman with a plan. I made myself coffee and stared out the window at the frost creeping up the glass. The garden outside lay quiet under a sheet of snow, every branch and hedge perfectly still. There was something honest about winter. It stripped everything down to its truth. And I was ready for the truth, no matter how ugly it turned out to be. That afternoon, I called Jack O'Neill. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since Carlos's funeral. Jack was an old friend of my husband's, a retired county records officer who knew more about property law than most lawyers I'd met. He still lived a few towns over in a weathered house with a big oak tree in front. "Mary Collins," he said, when he picked up his voice, gravelly but warm. "Well, I'll be. Haven't heard that name in a while." "I need your help, Jack," I said. "And before you ask, no, I'm not in trouble, but I might be if I don't get ahead of something." He laughed softly. "Sounds serious. Come by. Bring that famous banana bread if you've still got the recipe." 2 hours later, I was sitting in his cozy kitchen, the smell of old paper and cinnamon filling the air. Jack looked older, thinner, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He poured me coffee in a chipped mug that read, "County clerks never die. They just get filed away." So he said, leaning back in his chair, "Tell me what's going on." I told him everything: the mortgage, the payments, the text message that ended Christmas. I even admitted that I'd canceled the transfers the night before. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Well, Mary, you've been more than generous. But you might have tangled yourself into a knot without knowing it." "What do you mean?" He reached for a folder on the counter and pulled out a blank mortgage form. "You said you co-signed, right? That means your name is on the note, not the deed. You don't own the house. But if they stop paying, if that mortgage defaults, the bank won't go knocking on your son's door first. They'll come after you. Legally, you're the safer bet. You've got assets, a paid-off home, a clean record." I felt my stomach twist. "So even if I've paid for 5 years, I don't own an inch of that house. Not unless your name's on the deed. And from what you've told me, it's not." I stared down at my coffee, watching a small ripple form in the surface. "So I've been building their dream, and I'm the one who'll pay when it falls apart." Jack nodded slowly. "That's about the size of it." The room went quiet, except for the ticking of an old wall clock. I could feel anger rising in me, not the kind that bursts out in shouts, but the kind that burns low and steady. What if I said carefully they weren't entirely honest with the bank? What if the information they provided wasn't accurate? Jack raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about fraud. I'm talking about fairness," I said. "Because I know what Lena told me about her business. And I've seen her social media lavish trips, designer clothes. None of that matches what she claimed when they applied for that loan." Jack rubbed his chin. "If there are inconsistencies, fake income statements, false claims, the bank would want to know. But you'd need evidence. Something on paper. I have everything I said. Every payment I made, every message she ever sent about money. I just need to know where to look." He smiled faintly. "You always were meticulous. Start with the mortgage packet you signed. There's usually a copy of their financial disclosures. Look for her stated income and employer. If it doesn't line up with reality..." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You'd have leverage." That night back at home, I pulled out my old metal filing box from under the bed. It was heavy with years of record statements, receipts, contracts. I opened the folder marked Mortgage Agreement, Collins, and spread the papers across the kitchen table. The pages smelled faintly of ink and time. I read line after line until I found it. Borrower to Lena Hart Collins, Employer Lux Events LLC. Annual income $145,000. My breath caught. I remembered her mentioning the company once, a small event planning business she ran from her phone. There was no way it made that kind of money. I reached for my tablet and searched the business registry. Nothing. No such company. Not active, not even listed. A slow, cold satisfaction began to bloom in my chest. I sat back, letting out a small laugh that startled even me. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't the one at a disadvantage. I had the truth, and the truth had teeth. The clock ticked softly in the background, marking each second of a new kind of resolve. I gathered the papers into a neat stack, slid them into a fresh folder, and labeled it carefully in black ink evidence. Then I picked up the phone and called Jack again. When he answered, I said, "You were right, old friend. I think I found my leverage." He sounded amused. "What did you find?" I smiled into the receiver, glancing down at Lena's fake salary figures. "Well, Jack," I said slowly, "looks like I've been paying for fiction." That line still made me smile the next morning. It had been a long time since I'd smiled for reasons that weren't forced. I slept soundly that night, deeper than I had in months. It was as if discovering the truth had lifted something from me, something invisible but heavy. For years, I'd been pouring money into that house like water into a cracked vase, and now finally, I'd found where it had been leaking. By the time I made my morning tea, I already had a plan forming in the back of my mind. It wasn't revenge, exactly, not yet. It was more like a quiet correction of balance, a reminder that even the most patient woman has limits. The phone rang just as I sat down. Lena's name flashed across the screen, her tone sharp the moment I answered. "Mary," she said, skipping the greeting. "My parents are flying in from Chicago this afternoon. Their flight lands at 3. I need you to pick them up." I paused, taking a small sip of tea. "You need me to—" "Yes." She said the word drawn out like she was talking to someone slow. "David's working, and I'll be busy with the caterer. They're older, you know. I don't want them standing around waiting. Be useful for once." There it was, that little sting at the end. Be useful for once. She said it so casually, like an afterthought, but she knew what she was doing. I'd been useful all my life in ways she couldn't even imagine. But instead of rising to it, I smiled into the phone. "Of course, Lena," I said. 3 o'clock. I'll take care of it." "Good," she said, her tone softening, as if obedience was affection. "You can text me once they're in the car." "Will do," I replied. After she hung up, I let the quiet fill the kitchen. Outside, the sky was gray and thick, promising rain. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 10. I had plenty of time to do absolutely nothing. I spent the next few hours tidying the house, watering the few potted plants that had survived the cold, and even baking a small batch of cinnamon cookies. Around 2:30, the first drops of rain began tapping against the window. I imagined the Harts stepping off the plane, pulling their expensive coats tight, checking their watches as they scanned the crowd for me. I could see them so clearly that it almost felt like I was there. Mrs. Hart's pinched mouth. Mr. Hart's perpetual frown of mild disapproval. By 4, the rain had turned steady. I poured myself a mug of hot cocoa heavy on the whipped cream and settled into my armchair. It's a Wonderful Life was playing on TV, an old favorite. I'd seen it every Christmas since Carlos was alive. The irony wasn't lost on me watching George Bailey realize how much his life mattered, just as I was realizing how little mine seemed to matter to some people. I smiled at the thought. Funny how stories change depending on where you're sitting. Halfway through the movie, I imagined the Harts standing by the baggage claim scanning the thinning crowd. Maybe they'd tried to call Lena first, only to find her too busy with the caterer. Maybe they'd waited another hour before realizing no one was coming. I could picture them dragging their suitcases through the wet parking lot trying to hail a cab in the rain. Dayton's airport wasn't exactly known for its luxury. Around 6, my phone buzzed with a message from Lena. "Mom, did you pick them up?" "They're not answering." I took another slow sip of cocoa, savoring the warmth, before setting the mug down. I typed back, "Oh dear, I must have misunderstood. I thought you said 3 tomorrow. I hope they got there safely." Then I turned the phone face down and went back to my movie. By the time George Bailey shouted Merry Christmas at the end, I was smiling for real. The rain had stopped outside, leaving the streetlights gleaming on the wet pavement. I rinsed my mug, washed my hands, and just as I was drying them, the phone began to ring. I didn't have to look to know who it was. Lena didn't even wait for me to say hello. "Mary, where were you?" My parents waited for 3 hours. 3 hours. They had to pay $200 for a taxi. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? I kept my voice calm, gentle even. "Oh, Lena, I'm so sorry to hear that. Travel can be so unpredictable this time of year." "Unpredictable," she snapped. "You promised you'd pick them up." "I did," I said evenly. "And I also thought you'd be paying your mortgage on time." Seems we both had misunderstandings this week. There was a long silence on the other end. I could almost hear her realizing that something had shifted. Then she hissed, "You're unbelievable." "Maybe," I said, softly smiling as I watched the credits roll on the TV. "But I am finally honest." Before she could respond, I added, "Seems they finally experienced real economy class." I hung up before she could say another word. The house was quiet again, filled only with the soft hum of the heater and the faint echo of Christmas music from the credits. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one waiting at the airport. I felt like the pilot, finally steering my own flight. That sense of quiet control carried me through the next day, like a secret warmth only I could feel. I didn't rush, didn't worry. I tended my plants, folded laundry, and even baked a loaf of banana bread to bring to Helen later in the week. Everything felt calm, steady until my phone began to buzz. At first, I thought it might be David. He hadn't called since the airport fiasco, and I half expected an apology. But when I checked, it wasn't a call. It was a notification from Facebook. I rarely used the app, but curiosity got the better of me. The first line I saw made my stomach tighten, though not in surprise. Some people abandon family in a snowstorm. Shameful. It was posted by Lena, of course, and underneath it a picture of her parents looking drenched and pitiful in their raincoats at the airport curb. The caption read, "My poor parents. 3 hours stranded because someone forgot to pick them up. Disgraceful behavior from someone who pretends to be loving and kind." Dozens of comments were already flooding in, some from people I didn't know, others from mutual acquaintances. "That's awful, Lena. How could anyone do that?" "I hope karma teaches them a lesson." I almost laughed at that one. Karma, I thought, was already in the neighborhood. I scrolled through each comment more self-righteous than the last. Not one of them asked for my side of the story. That's the thing about gossip, it travels faster than truth and needs no passport. But I didn't feel angry, not even insulted. Instead, I felt something quieter and stronger, a kind of patience I hadn't known I possessed. I clicked the 3 dots in the corner of the post, and took screenshots of everything: the post, the comments, the shares. Every little digital dart Lena had thrown, I caught neatly in my files. Then I printed them out, each page sliding warm and crisp from the printer. I stacked them on this table and smoothed the edges with the palm of my hand. Evidence, not anger. A few hours later, Helen showed up holding her phone in one hand and a look of concern in the other. "Mary," she said, before even crossing the threshold, "have you seen what she's put up? It's all over the local group. People are saying you left her parents out in a blizzard." "It was rain," I said calmly. "A little chilly maybe, but no blizzard." Helen sighed, taking off her coat. "You need to say something. Defend yourself. People will believe whatever they see first." I know I said setting a cup of tea in front of her, but sometimes the first thing people see isn't the last thing they remember. She gave me a long, searching look. "You're too calm. That's either a very good sign or a very bad one." I smiled, stirring my tea. "Let her play her part, Helen. I'm rehearsing mine." Helen raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "Rehearsing?" For what? I took a sip before answering. "For truth. It has better timing than any lie." Helen shook her head, half amused, half worried. "You sound like you're plotting something." "Plotting," I said softly. "No. Preparing, maybe. There's a difference." She watched me for a moment, then glanced at the stack of papers on my desk. The printed screenshots, the neatly labeled folder that now sat beside them. "You've been busy," she said slowly. "I've been documenting," I corrected. "Sometimes silence needs a record." Helen laughed under her breath. "You and your proverbs. One of these days you're going to surprise the whole town." Maybe I said my voice calm, but certain. Or maybe the town will surprise itself. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the last few dry leaves against the window. The world looked gray and restless, like it was waiting for something to happen. Helen stayed a little longer, trying to coax more details out of me, but I didn't give her any. Some things grow better in quiet. As she stood to leave, she touched my shoulder. "You're planning something, aren't you?" I turned off the printer, smiled, and said, "Just letting karma use my Wi-Fi." She laughed, shaking her head as she walked toward the door. "Whatever you're cooking up, I hope they're ready." After she left, I stood for a moment in the quiet house, the hum of the heater, the only sound. I looked down at the pile of papers on my table. Lena's lies printed in black and white, and felt no anger, no need for public defense. Let her have her stage for now. Every actress eventually faces her final curtain. And when that moment came, I'd be right there in the front row, ready to applaud the ending she'd written all by herself. That thought stayed with me for days, humming softly in the back of my mind, like a song only I could hear. But I knew watching wasn't enough anymore. I needed facts, cold, clear, undeniable facts. Helen came over one afternoon with her laptop under her arm and 2 cups of coffee, balanced in a cardboard tray. "You said this Lux Events thing doesn't exist," she said, settling in at my dining table. "Let's see if we can prove it." I'd already pulled out the folder where I kept the documents from the mortgage application. There it was again, in Lena's neat handwriting: Employer Lux Events, LLC. Annual income, $145,000. I handed it to Helen. She told me it was her company. Supposedly, she planned luxury weddings and corporate parties. Helen snorted. "Luxury? She can't even plan a family dinner without chaos." I couldn't help but laugh softly, though my stomach felt tight. "Still, let's find out what this company actually is." Helen typed the name into the state business registry. Nothing. No active listing. No record of tax filings. Then she tried Google. There was a website, but it was barely functional, a single page with a stock photo of champagne glasses and a contact email. No phone number, no physical address, not even a privacy policy. "This is fake," Helen said flatly. "The whole thing looks like it was thrown together just to look legitimate." I leaned closer, frowning. "Can you check where it's registered from?" She grinned. "You're asking the right person." Her niece worked in IT, and Helen had picked up a few tricks. Within minutes, she was tracing the IP address listed in the website's domain registration. "Oh my," she murmured. "Mary, you're not going to believe this." "What, the IP location?" "It's the same as your son's house. Their Wi-Fi network." She made this entire thing from her kitchen. I stared at the screen, a mix of shock and bitter amusement rising in me. She created her own company out of thin air to convince the bank she had a job. Helen nodded. "Looks that way. Fraud, plain and simple." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and final. Fraud. It wasn't just deception. It was crime. I thought back to all those nights I'd written checks, all those times I'd believed I was helping my family stay afloat. And all the while, Lena had been floating on lies. We sat in silence for a few moments. The only sound was the steady tick of the wall clock. Then Helen said quietly, "You need to print this, every screenshot, every file. You'll want a paper trail." As I began saving the evidence, Helen's phone buzzed with a new message. She frowned. "It's from a mutual acquaintance. She's part of that same social circle Lena runs in. Apparently, Lena's been running her mouth again." I gave a humorless smile. "About me?" Helen hesitated. "About both of you." I watched as she turned the phone so I could see. The text messages were screenshots from a group chat. Lena's words scrolled across the screen, cold and cutting. "David's too weak to stand up to anyone. I only married him for stability." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. My heart didn't break, it clenched. David, my boy, who had always been kind, thoughtful, who'd worked hard his whole life just to make others comfortable. Weak, no. He was gentle. There's a difference, though. People like Lena never seem to understand it. Helen touched my hand. "Mary." I shook my head slowly. "He doesn't know." He'd never believe she said that. "Maybe not," Helen said softly. "But the truth doesn't stop being true just because someone refuses to see it." I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. My throat tightened. To expose Lena would mean shattering whatever illusion David still had of his marriage. To protect him would mean letting the lies keep growing. There was no painless choice, only the right one. Helen broke the silence again. "Sometimes the truth is the kindest cut," she said gently. "It hurts, but it frees." Her words settled into me like a seed finding soil. Painful, yes, but alive, capable of growth. I looked at the computer screen again, at the line where Lena had mocked the man who still defended her. My son didn't deserve pity. He deserved honesty. I took a deep breath and began printing. Each sheet that slid from the printer felt like another step away from the guilt that had trapped me. Page after page, Lena's fake company, her fraudulent numbers, her cruel messages. I stacked them carefully, the weight of them solid in my hands. When the last page finished printing, I reached for a new folder and wrote on the tab in clean, firm letters, "The Christmas Files." I placed the documents inside and closed it with a quiet click. The paper was still warm beneath my fingertips. I could almost hear Lena's voice somewhere in the distance, smooth and self-assured, rehearsing her lies. I smiled to myself, not out of anger this time, but out of certainty. This wouldn't just be my evidence. It would be my truth, and soon hers too. I remember sitting there in the stillness of that December morning, the folder resting on my lap like a loaded secret. The furnace clicked softly in the background, the kind of steady hum that fills a quiet house, and I realized how calm I felt. Not angry, not vindictive, just settled. For years, I'd been keeping the peace. Now I was keeping records. The next step was simple, but it required a kind of courage I hadn't used before. It's one thing to collect proof. It's another to hand it over and let the truth walk out into the light. I made myself a cup of tea, opened my laptop, and logged into the bank's online portal. There was a contact link for fraud and irregular activity. I clicked it and filled out the form attaching every document I had, 5 years of transfers from my account to theirs, every payment receipt labeled with their mortgage ID, and copies of Lena's fabricated income statements from Lux Events, LLC. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I just let the facts speak. At the bottom of the form, there was a small box labeled "Describe your concern." I typed possible falsified income declaration and third-party mortgage payments not disclosed to lender. My finger hovered over the submit button for a moment. I could almost hear Carlos's voice in the back of my mind saying, "Mary, you've got a right to fairness." And with that, I pressed send. The confirmation message popped up on the screen, and it felt final, almost ceremonial. Somewhere in a bank office, someone was going to read my words and follow the trail I had left. I shut the laptop, exhaled slowly, and looked out the window. Snow was falling again, light, steady flakes swirling against the gray sky. It looked peaceful, but I knew that underneath that calm, something had started to move. By the next morning, I received an email from the bank's fraud department. A polite but formal message thanking me for my submission and confirming that my information had been forwarded for internal review. "We take such matters very seriously," it said. I smiled at that line. I knew they did, especially when mortgage fraud was involved. That evening, I called Jack to let him know what I'd done. He answered on the second ring. "You really went through with it, didn't you?" "I did," I said simply. "And now we wait." He chuckled. "Patience and paperwork, Mary. They're the two deadliest weapons in the world." He wasn't wrong. The next 2 days stretched out long and quiet. I went about my usual routine, watering the plants, feeding the neighbor's cat, while she was away, chatting briefly with Helen when she stopped by. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. I felt lighter, like I'd shifted the balance of things back toward truth. On the second evening, I noticed an odd notification when I logged into my online account. The automatic payment to the mortgage, though canceled, still appeared in the list of linked transactions, but now it had a red banner across it. "Account under review, temporarily suspended." I clicked it open. A message appeared at the top. "This account has been frozen, pending verification of reported income and payment sources. Please contact your lender immediately." I sat back in my chair and let out a slow, steady breath. It was happening. The next morning, the phone started ringing before sunrise. I ignored the first few calls, assuming it was spam. By the fifth, I glanced at the caller ID, David. I didn't answer. Then came another, and another. Then Lena's name flashed across the screen, and I could almost picture her pacing their kitchen in that robe she wore when she wanted to look important. The calls kept coming, 6, 10, 12. By mid-morning, the number had climbed to 22 missed calls. I didn't need to guess what they were about. The bank must have contacted them. Maybe they'd tried to make their usual payment only to find the account frozen. Maybe someone from the fraud department had called to verify Lena's employment information only to discover there was no such company. I imagined her face going pale, that polished calm of hers, cracking at the edges as she realized what it meant. I poured myself a cup of cocoa, extra marshmallows this time, and sat by the window. The snow outside had stopped, and the world looked clean, untouched. My phone buzzed again, lighting up with David's name, then Lena's right after. I let it vibrate until it went quiet. A message came through next, David's voice on voicemail, shaky and urgent. "Mom, something's wrong with the bank. They froze our account. They're saying something about an investigation. Please call me, please." I could hear the panic beneath his words, and for a second, a pang of guilt flickered. Then I remembered every check I'd written, every insult I'd swallowed, every quiet humiliation they'd handed me in return for my generosity. Justice doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. It sometimes comes through an email form and a paper trail. I set down my mug and looked out at the snowy street once more. My reflection in the glass looked calm, older perhaps, but content. The kind of woman who had finally stopped apologizing for being right. I picked up the phone, scrolled through the missed calls, and pressed the side button until the screen went black. "Merry Christmas to me," I said softly, and the quiet that followed felt like peace. The phone had stopped ringing. The snow outside lay smooth and untouched, and for the first time in years I didn't feel like I owed anyone anything. My tea tasted stronger, the air felt lighter, and my heart quiet as it was felt steady. I thought that would be the end of it. But then, as life often does, it handed me one more scene before the curtain could fall. It started with Helen dropping by, her cheeks pink from the cold. She came holding her phone like it was something toxic. "You've got to see this," she said, sliding it across my table. On the screen was Lena's latest social media post, a glittering Christmas invitation written in gold cursive titled, "Christmas Eve at the Collins home. A night of joy, elegance, and gratitude," it read. "Celebrating family and blessings." I almost choked on my tea. "Gratitude," I repeated. "That's rich." Helen sighed. "She's inviting 12 guests, her parents, some friends, and get this, a local journalist from the lifestyle section. Probably wants to get her face back in the paper after that little banking issue." I couldn't help but smile. So she's rebuilding her empire with tinsel and champagne. She's posting every step, Helen said. Photos of decorations, the menu, even the floral centerpieces. She's really trying to make it look like nothing's wrong. I looked at the photo, a long dining table set for 12 polished silverware, white candles glowing in crystal holders. The caption underneath read, "No storm can dim true joy." I set the phone down gently. "No," I said softly, "but it can wash away illusions." Helen studied me for a moment. "You're thinking of going, aren't you?" I didn't answer right away. My gaze drifted to the corner of the room where the folder labeled "The Christmas Files" sat neatly on my desk. "If she's inviting the world to her stage," I said, "maybe it's time someone handed out the script." Helen shook her head, half smiling. "You really are something else." Christmas Eve arrived with a cold wind and the faint scent of snow in the air. I dressed carefully, not in anything extravagant, but in a simple navy coat. The one Carlos used to say made my eyes look steadfast. I packed 12 small red gift bags into a canvas tote. Inside each one was a folded document printed on crisp white paper, sealed with a gold ribbon. I tied each bow myself, steady and slow, like tying the last knot in a long journey. When I pulled up to their house, the driveway was lined with cars. The lights inside glowed warm against the evening sky, and through the window I could see people laughing, glasses clinking. The air outside was sharp and cold, biting at my cheeks as I walked to the front door. Music spilled out when I knocked some cheerful jazz version of Silent Night. I heard voices, the shuffle of hurried footsteps, and then the door opened. Lena stood there framed in golden light, wearing a sequined dress that sparkled like it had been stitched from pride itself. For a second, she froze. Her face went through a dozen small changes, shock, irritation, calculation, before landing on a carefully painted smile. "Well," she said, her tone honeyed and tight look, who finally showed up. I smiled back, calm and even. "Merry Christmas, Lena." Her eyes darted to the red gift bags in my hand. "You brought presents for everyone," I said. "It's a season of giving, after all." Behind her, I could see the guests, a dozen faces turned toward the door, curious. Her parents were there, seated near the fireplace, looking exactly as I remembered them, dignified, judgmental, and vaguely bored. The journalist stood near the dining table, notebook in hand, clearly ready to write about the Collins family's grand Christmas Eve. Lena hesitated for a heartbeat too long, then stepped aside with forced cheer. "Well, don't just stand there, come in!" The warmth hit me as soon as I stepped inside, the scent of roasted ham and cinnamon, mingling with something faintly artificial, like desperation, masked by potpourri. I could feel the eyes of every guest following me as I walked in. The decorations gleamed, every surface sparkling under golden light. It was beautiful, I'll give her that. But it all felt fragile, like one wrong word might shatter it. "Such a surprise," Lena said, her voice carrying across the room. "Everyone, this is Mary David's mother. She decided to join us after all." There was polite applause, awkward and short-lived. I smiled at them, all holding out the red bags. "A little something for each of you," I said, "a token of appreciation for being part of our family's story." The journalist tilted her head, intrigued. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Collins." I nodded, placing the bags one by one on the table beside the glowing candles. Each little package looked innocent enough, but I knew what rested inside: truth, neatly printed and tied with gold. Lena was still smiling, but her jaw had tightened. "Well," she said, laughing lightly, "you've certainly made an entrance." I met her eyes, holding her gaze just long enough to let her see that I wasn't there to play along anymore. Oh, I wouldn't miss this show for the world. The room went still for a heartbeat, and then the chatter resumed, forced and brittle, like glass trying not to crack. Lena laughed too loudly and gestured toward the table. "Everyone, let's eat. The roast is getting cold." Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I could feel her pulse of panic beneath the glittering surface. She thought she could outshine the truth with a chandelier and champagne. I almost admired her nerve. I moved toward the table, where the 12 red gift bags sat neatly in a row, gleaming under the candlelight. The guests, her friends, her parents, and that journalist from the Dayton Chronicle watched me curiously. They didn't know me well, just what Lena had told them. I could see it in their polite smiles, the same ones people use when they think they're above you, but too refined to say so. "I brought something special," I said, my voice calm and even. "It's Christmas after all. Everyone deserves a gift." Lena's hand fluttered to her necklace. "Mary, that's really not necessary." "Oh, but it is," I interrupted gently. "You see, I've been doing some tidying up this year, and I came across a few things that belong to this family. It didn't feel right keeping them to myself." The journalist perked up, sensing tension. She pulled a small notepad from her clutch, pretending to fan herself with it. "This is quite the evening," she murmured. Lena's father, Mr. Hart, reached for one of the bags. "May we open them?" he asked, clearly amused. "Please," I said. "I insist." One by one, the guests untied the golden ribbons and drew out the papers inside. The sound of rustling envelopes filled the room, followed by the faint clink of a fork falling onto a plate. The first reaction came from Lena's mother, whose voice wavered between outrage and disbelief. "Lena, these are bank statements." Lena's face drained of color. "What?" "Not just bank statements," I said, stepping closer, my tone still calm. "Proof of every mortgage payment I made on your behalf for 5 years. Proof that the life you've been showing off, the furniture, the vacations, the luxury, wasn't built by your hard work. It was built by mine. The room went utterly still. The candles flickered. The journalist's pen froze above her notepad. Lena's laugh was high and brittle. "This is ridiculous. You must be mistaken." "Oh, I wish I were," I said, reaching into my coat pocket. "But that's not all." I pulled out a small speaker and set it on the table. "You see, words have weight, and sometimes they echo." I pressed play. The room filled with Lena's voice, recorded from one of the many group chats Helen had recovered. Her tone was unmistakable, smooth, smug, careless. That Mexican maid should be grateful we let her visit. The air seemed to leave the room. Someone gasped. The journalist's eyes widened, and I saw a man at the far end shake his head slowly, muttering, "My God." Lena shot to her feet, her face flushing crimson. "That's out of context. It was a joke." Her father looked mortified. "Lena, please, it was a joke," she repeated, voice breaking. "You're all taking it the wrong way." But I didn't give her a chance to recover. "A joke?" I asked softly. Funny, I never found prejudice particularly humorous. Especially not when it's aimed at someone who paid $200,000 to help you have this life. I let the number hang there solid and heavy. That's $200,000 worth of love, but I guess it didn't match your Christmas theme. Her parents looked at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. One of the guests whispered something to another, and soon a ripple of murmurs moved around the room. The journalist, ever the opportunist, stepped forward, flipping to a fresh page in her notebook. Before Lena could speak again, there was a voice from the doorway. "I think we can confirm that figure." Everyone turned. Jack stood there in a dark winter coat holding an envelope. He gave a small, polite nod to me before addressing the room. "Jack O'Neill. New neighbor," he said casually. "I used to work for the county records office. Mrs. Collins here mentioned a concern about a certain mortgage irregularity." He opened the envelope and pulled out a document stamped with the bank's insignia. "The bank has confirmed an active investigation into the account under Mr. and Mrs. Collins. Falsified income declaration, pending review." Lena swayed slightly, clutching the back of a chair for balance. "You can't, this isn't." Jack's tone remained courteous. "I'm afraid it is." The silence that followed was long and suffocating. Then someone's phone buzzed, slicing through the tension. The journalist looked down, her eyes widening. "Breaking news," she said softly. "The bank's fraud division just released a statement confirming multiple investigations into falsified mortgage applications. Some of the cases are local." She lifted her gaze to Lena. "This story needs to be told." The room erupted into whispers, the kind of low, shocked murmurs that ripple through polite society when its illusions collapse. I stood there, calm and unmoving, watching Lena sink slowly into her seat, her sequined dress suddenly looking like armor that no longer fit. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished, like a chapter finally closing. The truth was out, and I didn't need to raise my voice to make it heard. I simply turned to the journalist and said, "Merry Christmas." The next morning, the world felt unnaturally quiet. I woke early, brewed my coffee, and sat by the kitchen window, half expecting to feel some pang of guilt. But there was nothing, just calm. Snow had fallen overnight, blanketing everything in white. It looked peaceful, like the world had hit pause. But when I opened my phone, I realized it had done the opposite. The article had gone live before sunrise. "Mother exposes family hypocrisy and class prejudice," that was the headline. The journalist had written it with surprising grace, weaving together Lena's social media life, her disdainful comments, and the documents I'd provided. She didn't use every detail, but she didn't have to. The contrast between Lena's perfect Christmas image and the truth was striking enough. There were photos from the party. One caught me standing near the tree, looking calm, while Lena's expression twisted in shock. The caption beneath it read, "Dignity in Silence." By noon, the story had spread across local news sites and Facebook feeds. I didn't have to go looking for it. The notifications poured in on their own. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months were sharing the link, adding comments like, "Finally, someone stood up to that woman, and Mary Collins deserves a medal." It felt strange seeing my name like that public praised. I never wanted fame. I just wanted fairness. Helen called first. "You've officially broken the internet," she said, her voice full of awe. "You're all over town news. The comments are wild. Some people are calling you Saint Mary of Suburbia." I laughed softly. "Let's hope the sainthood doesn't come with paperwork," she chuckled. "Seriously, though, you handled that with class. Everyone's talking about how calm you were, how you didn't raise your voice once." "That's the thing about truth," I said quietly. "It doesn't need to shout." That afternoon, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find a small bouquet sitting on the porch, white lilies and winter greenery tied with a red ribbon. The card said, "For your grace under fire," from the millers next door. I smiled and brought it inside, setting it on the counter beside the growing pile of similar gestures. By evening, there were half a dozen arrangements, roses, poinsettias, even a small evergreen wreath. Quiet respect had replaced gossip. Meanwhile, Lena's world was unraveling. I didn't have to hear it from her. The internet told the story for her. Her once perfect social media accounts had gone silent. A post from one of her business partners confirmed that her brand collaborations were suspended pending review. The local influencer pages, once full of praise, had turned against her. Screenshots of her comments, especially that one line about the Mexican maid, spread fast. No amount of apology could scrub that away. By the second day, her parents' names started trending too. Mr. and Mrs. Hart were pillars of their church and community, and people began asking how they'd raised a daughter capable of such cruelty. One post simply said, "Apples don't fall far from silver trees." I almost felt sorry for them, but then I remembered the look of quiet approval they'd worn every time Lena spoke down to me. They'd sown arrogance for years. Now they were finally seeing what grew. The bank's involvement came next. An envelope arrived by certified mail addressed to me. Inside was a formal letter, thanking me for my assistance in a pending investigation regarding mortgage misrepresentation. It confirmed that the account tied to David and Lena's property was officially under fraud review, and all associated funds were temporarily frozen. There it was proof that truth had weight, not just words. I folded the letter neatly and added it to the Christmas files. That night I sat by the fire with Helen sipping hot cider. "So what now?" she asked gently. "Now," I said. "Now I rest." "You're not angry?" "No," I said, and meant it. "I think anger's what got us here. I just want peace." She nodded. "You know, I think you might actually get it." We talked a while longer about small things, the weather, the neighbors' decorations, her granddaughter's school play. It felt good to speak about normal life again, like the storm had finally passed. But as the clock neared 10, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at the screen, expecting another message from Helen's group chat or a thank you text from a neighbor. Instead, it was a name I hadn't seen in days. David. The phone vibrated again, persistent this time. I hesitated before picking it up. Helen looked at me, eyes full of concern. "You going to answer?" I took a deep breath, the glow of the fire reflecting off the phone's screen. "Maybe," I said, softly. "Maybe it's time." I let it ring once more before swiping to answer. His voice came through quieter than I remembered, laced with something I hadn't heard from him in years, humility. "Mom." he said, his breath catching slightly. "We need to talk." I hadn't heard my son's voice sound that fragile since he was a boy. The line was quiet for a moment, just the soft sound of his uneven breathing. I told him to come over, and he said he was already in the driveway. When I opened the door, the cold air hit first, then David's face pale, drawn, the weight of weeks showing in his eyes. He looked older than his 37 years, like the world had finally caught up to him. "Come inside," I said softly. He stepped in, shoulders slumped, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. He stood in the kitchen for a while without speaking, his gaze on the floor. The smell of coffee filled the air, but neither of us reached for it. Finally, he spoke, his voice cracking at the edges. "She tried to run Mom. Lena, she tried to go to Canada." I didn't flinch. I'd suspected something like this might happen. When 2 nights ago, she told me she was going to visit a cousin in Toronto, said she just needed time away from all the attention. I didn't believe her, but I didn't stop her either. This morning, I got a call from the authorities. He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. They detained her at the border. She's under investigation for mortgage fraud. Her name was flagged. He looked up then, and for the first time in a long while, he looked at me the way he used to when he was a boy, like he needed an anchor. "They said the case was reported weeks ago," he said quietly. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" I nodded. I didn't know when, but yes, I knew it would come eventually. His eyes softened, full of pain, and something else, respect maybe. "You reported her. I reported the truth I corrected. What she did, not who she was." He nodded slowly, then ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small kitchen. "She called me," he said, his voice dropping lower. "From the detention center. They let her make one call. She was crying, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. She said it was all a misunderstanding, that she just needed bail, that if I helped her this one last time, she'd make it right." He paused, his voice trembling. I almost believed her. "God help me, Mom, I almost did." I stayed silent, letting him speak, letting him spill the kind of pain that can't be interrupted. "She said she loved me, that we could start over somewhere new." And for a second I wanted to believe her, because it was easier than admitting that the woman I built my life with used me. Used you. He stopped pacing, his eyes glistening. But then I remembered everything. The lies, the way she talked to you, the money, the embarrassment. And I realized it was never love. It was convenience. He sank into the chair across from me, his hands trembling slightly. "She begged me for bail. I said no." I felt something shift inside me, not joy, not vengeance, but a quiet kind of pride. My son had finally drawn his own line in the sand. I poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the table. "That couldn't have been easy." He shook his head. "It wasn't. But for the first time, it felt right." We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the faint ticking of the wall clock. The snow outside was falling again, slow and steady, softening the edges of the world. He finally looked up at me. "She kept saying this wasn't her fault, that you set her up." I let out a quiet breath. People like Lena can't imagine consequences that aren't someone else's doing. She's never been taught that truth doesn't bend for comfort. He nodded, staring into his cup. "I think I knew deep down, even before all this. I just didn't want to face it. That's what love does," I said. "It blinds us where we most want to see." He laughed softly, bitterly. "You sound like Dad." "I'll take that as a compliment." We shared a small smile, fragile but real. For the first time in years, we were speaking to each other as equals, not as a son and mother weighed down by guilt and distance. He rubbed his temples. "They said she might face formal charges soon." If they prove the income fraud and the false documentation, it could mean prison time. I nodded slowly, the gravity of it settling in the space between us. That's between her and the law now. He looked at me, searching my face for judgment or relief, but I offered neither. Only truth. She'll hate you for this, he said softly. Maybe I said. But sometimes hate is just what love looks like when it's not ready to be honest. He looked down again, the weight of everything catching up to him. His hands were shaking, and for a moment I reached across the table and rested mine over his. His fingers curled around mine automatically, like they had when he was little. We stayed like that for a moment, silent but steady. Then I said quietly, "You did the right thing, David." He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "I just don't know what happens now." "Now," I said, squeezing his hand, "you learn to stand on your own." He looked at me confused, and I smiled faintly. "Good," I said. "Some storms you have to stand in." After David left, the house felt unusually still. The storm outside had passed, but the quiet it left behind was thick and deep, like the world was holding its breath. I sat in the same chair by the window, long after his car pulled away, the last of the day's light fading to soft gray. There was peace now, but also something tender and aching beneath it. Justice had come, but justice alone doesn't fill the spaces love leaves behind. I got up slowly, walking through the house as if seeing it new again. The photos on the wall, the birthdays, the picnics, the Christmas mornings, each one carried its own story. Most of them were happy ones, untouched by the bitterness that had grown between us these past years. When I reached the bookshelf in the corner, I noticed a small pile of envelopes tucked behind an old ceramic vase. They must have fallen there months ago, maybe longer. I started to gather them, ready to toss them into the bin with the rest of the clutter, when one small envelope caught my eye. The handwriting was round, uneven, almost shaky. It said, "To Grandma," from Ethan. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the name. My chest tightened. Ethan, my grandson. I hadn't seen him since the Christmas before everything changed. He'd been 7 then, with his father's eyes and a laugh that could melt ice. I sat down, holding the envelope like it was made of glass. The postmark was from nearly a year ago. I opened it carefully, unfolding the paper inside. It was a crayon drawing of a snowman holding hands with 2 stick figures, a little boy and an older woman with gray hair. Above them, in bright red letters, he had written, "Grandma, I miss your hugs. Mom says you can't come, but I wish you would." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I pressed the paper against my chest, the sob rising before I could stop it. It wasn't loud or bitter, just soft, like something deep inside me had cracked open after years of holding steady. The tears weren't for Lena or the lies or even the lost money. They were for the time I'd missed. The birthdays I wasn't invited to, the hugs that never happened, the love that had been pushed aside while adults played their cruel games. I didn't know if Lena had hidden the letter or if it had simply gotten lost in the shuffle of those chaotic months. But as I held it, none of that mattered. All I could see was Ethan's hope, pure, untainted, reaching across the noise. Children have a way of cutting straight to truth without even trying. After a while, I went to the fireplace mantel and took down an old photo of Carlos, my husband. He was smiling in it, his arm around me, his eyes warm and knowing. I remembered how he used to say, "In the end, Mary loves the only thing that sticks. Everything else washes away." He'd been right. I found an empty frame in the hallway closet. Simple wood, a little scratched but sturdy. I placed Ethan's letter inside, smoothing the paper carefully before closing the glass. Then I set it beside Carlos's picture on the mantel. The two of them side by side, the past and the future. My family in all its broken, beautiful pieces. I stood there for a long time watching the light from the fire flicker over their faces. The house no longer felt so empty. Somewhere deep inside, something small and hopeful stirred like a candle being lit again after too long in the dark. I whispered softly, "Maybe next Christmas, my love." The wind outside shifted, brushing against the windows like a sigh. I turned toward the sound, wiping my eyes, when suddenly the doorbell rang. It startled me, not because it was loud, but because it felt unexpected, almost impossible. Who could it be at this hour? I hesitated, my hand halfway to the doorknob. Then I opened it. There they were. David stood on the porch, snow caught in his hair, his face pale but determined. And beside him, clutching a single red rose, was Ethan. He looked up at me with those same wide eyes. I remembered the corners of his mouth twitching into a shy smile. "Hi, Grandma," he said softly. The cold air rushed in around them, but all I felt was warmth spreading through my chest. The kind of warmth no fire could make, the kind that only comes when life, after breaking you, offers you something to hold again. The rose trembled slightly in Ethan's small hand. "Dad said you might let us in," he whispered. I couldn't speak at first. My throat was tight, my heart full. I just nodded and stepped aside, my voice catching on a breath. "Of course," I said. "Come in, sweetheart." As they stepped inside, the framed letter by the fire seemed to glow brighter, the light from the flames catching the edges of Carlos's photo. And for the first time in years, the house felt full again. The sound of laughter drifted through the kitchen as Ethan sat at the table, drawing with a handful of colored pencils I'd dug out from a drawer. David stood near the counter, a mug of coffee in his hands, his shoulders finally relaxed. For once, there was no weight in the air, no secrets pressing between us, just quiet, ordinary warmth. It was later, after Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked under his chin, that David turned to me. His voice was soft, hesitant. "Mom," he said, "do you think you can ever forgive her?" I looked at him for a long time before answering. His face was drawn but calmer than before, as if he'd finally found steady ground after years of sinking. I thought about Lena, her lies, her cruelty, her hollow ambition. And then I thought of the young woman she might have been before all that hardened her. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't a gift for the deserving. It was freedom for the one who gave it. "I already did," I said quietly. "But forgiveness isn't rescue." David looked down, turning the mug in his hands. "She's lost everything," he said. "Her parents won't even speak to her. She's living with a friend now, working odd jobs. She still has choices," I said. "That's more than some people get." He nodded, though the guilt still clung to him. "I just wish things had turned out differently." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "So do I said. "But wishing doesn't plant anything new. You have to start fresh." The months that followed moved quietly, like the slow shift from winter to spring. The snow melted from the garden beds outside, revealing the dark, rich soil beneath. Every year, I ran a small community project, a garden program for retirees and young families, a place where people could grow their own food and find a little peace in the process. It had always been my sanctuary, but that year it became something more. Renewal. One morning in early April, I sat at my desk reviewing volunteer applications for the new season. The stack was thin this year, just a few familiar names and some new ones. Then I saw it. Lena Hart Collins. My hands stilled. Her handwriting was as neat as ever, her application short and formal. She'd written that she was seeking meaningful work and wanted a chance to give back to the community. There was no mention of our past. For a long moment, I just stared at it. Part of me wondered if this was her way of reaching out, of asking for something more than work, maybe grace, maybe redemption. Another part of me knew what accepting her would mean, reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. I took a deep breath and wrote my response. It was kind, but clear. Dear Lena, I appreciate your interest in our community garden. At this time, we've filled our available positions. I wish you well on your continued journey toward growth and peace. When I dropped the letter into the mailbox, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Forgiveness, I realized, didn't mean crossing back into old pain. It meant closing the gate gently and tending to your own side of the fence. Weeks passed. The garden bloomed early that year, tulips bright and defiant tomatoes, already taking hold in their planters. Ethan visited often, helping me water the seedlings with his small plastic watering can. He talked about school, about the new puppy David had promised him. Sometimes, when he laughed, I caught a glimpse of Carlos in him, the same warmth, the same unshakable goodness. Then one quiet afternoon in May, the mail arrived. Among the bills and newsletters was a small white envelope with no return address. The handwriting was delicate, precise. I didn't have to guess who it was from. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Mary, it began. I wanted to thank you not for the money or for what you exposed, but for what you refused to do. You didn't save me, and I finally understand that was the truest kindness of all. Thank you for teaching me what I couldn't buy. There was no signature. She didn't need one. I sat with the letter for a while, the late afternoon light slanting across the page. Somewhere outside, I could hear the rustle of the garden, the faint hum of bees among the blossoms. I thought about how strange it was the way life grows from broken soil. Sometimes the hardest lessons sprout from the darkest places. I folded the letter neatly and tucked it into the small wooden box where I kept Ethan's drawing and Carlos's old watch. Then I stood and looked out the window at the rows of green stretching across the yard. The earth was steady, forgiving in its own way. Growth takes soil, I murmured to myself, sliding the box shut. Not pity. That was nearly a year ago. Since then, life has moved at its own quiet pace. No grand surprises, no sharp turns, just the steady rhythm of days spent tending to what's real. The garden grew beautifully that spring, fuller than ever before. By summer, the community project had doubled in size, and there were more hands than I'd ever had, helping me plant weed and water. It was good work, honest and grounding. The kind of work that leaves your body tired, but your heart light. Helen still came by every week, usually bringing something warm from her kitchen: apple pie, cornbread, or, on rougher days, a bottle of red wine. David and Ethan started visiting every Sunday, at first cautiously, as if we were all afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled between us. But over time, the hesitation faded. Ethan would run through the garden with a watering can too big for him, splashing more water on himself than on the plants. David would help me repair the old wooden fence out back, our conversations quiet but easy. There were moments when I caught him glancing at the photo of Carlos on the mantel, the one next to Ethan's letter, and I could see in his face a kind of understanding that words could never capture. He knew now, not just what I'd done, but why. The distance that had once stretched between us was gone, replaced by something gentler: mutual respect, the kind that grows only after weathering storms together. And now it was December again. I woke that morning to the soft hush of snow falling outside the world, wrapped in white. The air carried that unmistakable scent of winter, clean, cold, and full of memory. The house, once so empty, now hummed with warmth. A slow melody played from the record player in the corner, one of Carlos's old Christmas albums, the kind that crackled faintly between songs. The scent of cinnamon and roasted chicken filled the air. For the first time in years, I was hosting Christmas dinner again. Helen arrived first, bundled in a wool coat, carrying a pecan pie and her usual cheer. "Your house smells like heaven," she said, hanging her scarf on the rack. "It smells like forgiveness," I teased, and she laughed, swatting my arm. My cousins from New Mexico came next, a little noisy, a little late, bringing with them stories, gifts, and laughter that bounced off the walls. I had almost forgotten what that kind of joyful chaos felt like. And then, just as the clock struck 5, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, the cold air rushed in, and with it, David and Ethan. David was holding a tray covered in foil, the smell immediately familiar and comforting. "Tamales," he said, grinning, "just like Dad used to make." I smiled and stepped aside. "Then you've saved Christmas dinner." Ethan ran in first, his arms full of ornaments he'd made at school. "Grandma, we brought these for your tree. Look, this one's me and you." He held up a lopsided clay ornament, shaped like 2 smiling faces, painted bright red and green. I crouched to take it, my throat tightening as I looked at it. "It's beautiful," I said softly. "Thank you, sweetheart." He beamed and dashed off toward the living room, where Helen and my cousins were stringing lights and setting out candles. David followed me into the kitchen, setting the tamales down on the counter. For a moment, he just looked around the house, the tree glowing softly in the corner, the sound of laughter echoing through the rooms. Then he turned to me and said almost in a whisper, "Home feels right again." I reached up and touched his cheek the way I used to when he was little. "It always was," I said. "It just needed tending." Dinner was loud and full of life. We ate until our plates were empty, talked until our voices grew hoarse, and laughed until we had tears in our eyes. Helen insisted on telling the story of how she first met Carlos for the 50th time, and my cousins argued over whose chili recipe was best. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to tick happier. Later, after the dishes were washed and the candles burned low, we gathered around the old tree. It was the same one Carlos and I had bought 20 years ago, its branches uneven but strong, the ornaments a mix of old glass bulbs and new handmade treasures. Ethan hung the last one a tiny silver star at the very top, standing on his tiptoes, while David steadied him. When the lights were plugged in, the room filled with a warm golden glow. Everyone grew quiet for a moment, watching the lights dance against the window pane. Outside, snow fell in soft, slow flakes, blanketing the garden in white. I sat back in my chair, letting the warmth wash over me. The fire crackled, the tree glimmered, and the faces around me glowed with peace. It struck me then how strange forgiveness is, how it doesn't erase what happened, but softens its edges until it fits inside your heart without cutting. I thought of Lena then, not with anger, not even pity, just a distant kind of understanding. People break in different ways. Some shatter loud and fast, others quietly over years. I hoped wherever she was, she'd found a way to plant something real in the ruins of her old life. As the night deepened, I found myself speaking without meaning to, almost as if narrating to the air. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," I said softly. "It means remembering and choosing peace anyway." David looked over at me, smiling faintly. "That sounds like something Dad would have said." "Maybe he did," I said. "Maybe I'm just finally hearing it." The clock chimed 9, and Helen began passing out mugs of hot cocoa. Ethan curled up on the couch, his eyes already fluttering with sleep. The world outside was silent except for the whisper of the falling snow. I stood by the window for a long moment, watching it drift gently across the garden, the same one where everything had begun to heal. The lights from inside reflected faintly in the glass. Helen, laughing, David, smiling, Ethan asleep. My heart felt steady, full, and utterly at peace. This year I whispered as the snow kept falling. I was finally invited by life itself. And that was my story. A story about love, pride, and the long road to peace. Sometimes life doesn't hand us the endings we expect, but it always gives us a chance to write a better one if we're brave enough to keep turning the page. I found my peace not in winning, not in proving anything, but in choosing kindness when I could have chosen anger. That's what forgiveness really is. It's not weakness, it's freedom. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or maybe someone you've had to let go, then I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a moment where forgiveness felt like the hardest but truest choice? Tell me in the comments below. Your stories matter too. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real stories about strength, redemption, and the quiet power of starting over, make sure to subscribe and stay with me for the next one. Every week, we'll walk through another life, another lesson, another reminder that even the hardest winters end in spring. Thank you for listening, for feeling, and for sharing this moment with me. Until next time. Hold on to hope, keep your heart open, and remember peace doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from finally forgiving yourself.